this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is your host, Webster Tarpley, speaking from the slightly sunny but slightly hazy banks of the Potomac. As we record here, it's the afternoon of August 24th, 2018. And what a week it has been. When the history of our time comes to be written, there is no doubt in my mind that this past Tuesday, the 21st of August, is going to be marked as a watershed, a turning point, in the Latin, a punctum saliens, in our time, a critical historical turning point, I guess we could say. And this is the language of the drama. So this is, in other words, the moment where the closing of the ring turns quite possibly into the beginning of the end. Not the end, and not even necessarily that close to the end, but the beginning, the very beginning of the end. And of course, what we're marking is the current tenant of the Oval Office. Listen carefully to what I say and to what I don't say. The tenant of the Oval, the tenant of the White House, has now been designated in official papers approved by the U.S. Department of Justice through the powerful Southern District of New York and by an independent federal district judge, Judge Pauley, that the current holder of the Oval, the usurper of Pennsylvania Avenue, we might well say, has been designated as an unindicted co-conspirator in federal crimes. Two of them. One of them is Stormy. The other one is the Playmate. The little subtext, Stormy and the Playmate. How about that for a short story on the side? And it means also that the blowhard Trump is now implicated in a federal crime, and it's a serious one. It's an attempt to skew the 2016 election by hiding altogether about $250,000 of campaign contributions and procuring the silence of two charming ladies whose outspoken and vehement testimony would have done incalculable damage to the cause of the libertine playboy Trump, especially even among his most gullible evangelical supporters. So that is what we have gone through. And make no mistake about that. That is, it's not an indictment. It's not a guilty verdict. It's not a jail sentence. But it is an official statement of a number of parts of the U.S. government. It also subsumes the statement of the grand juries that are often implied in these things. So that was a turning point. And what you can see now is the interesting statistic that on the Wednesday, the day after it, the discussion of impeachment is now everywhere. Impeachment is now the word on everyone's lips. You hear it in all quarters. Trump talks about it himself. He says, how can you impeach me when I'm doing such a wonderful job? I'm doing a great job. Look at this economy. What does it matter if I may have violated laws, he says, in effect, right, if I'm operating outside the law? We're hearing frequently the quotation from George Mason, the founding father, not my favorite founding father, mind you, but one of them, present at the Constitutional Convention anyway, who wanted to make clear that the impeachment power had to extend to deeds done before taking office, specifically to be able to deal with an adventurer who seized the presidency based on false pretenses, lies, and deceptions, gets himself into power. There's got to be a mechanism to deal with that. It is not limited to simply what happens after you get inaugurated. And, of course, we've cited here many times the Alexander Hamilton Federalist, where he says it's a remedy, impeachment is a remedy for an injury, an attack on the entire society. So I think there were quite a few people who watched the interesting statement from Robert Khuzami. Robert Khuzami is the Deputy United States Attorney in the Southern District, Manhattan. And Khuzami, I think he's the son of Lebanese Christian immigrants, gave what I thought was one of the better defenses of the rule of law. And what we're doing on my weekday program, The American System, we're going to be discussing a couple of moments of classical music and drama that reflect the idea that Khuzami was giving, that society is reasserting itself. Order is being reasserted against chaos. Law is being reasserted against anarchy. And predictability being asserted against limitless caprice and tantrums. And the comparisons we're going to be examining, and you're invited to join us. Beethoven's Fidelio, and in particular the final act where tyranny is ended and justice is restored. Beethoven's Fidelio, last act. The drama Tartuffe, Tartuffe, that's by the French comic writer Molière, writing under Louis the 14th, back in the late, well, not too late, but the 1600s, the story of a religious hypocrite who attempts to swindle his follower, but is then prevented by an intervention directly from the king. In both Fidelio and in Tartuffe, it's the king who restores justice. In other words, the state, as they understood it in those days. And then King Lear, probably the most chilling of these, the most horrifying in many ways. If you tamper with the hierarchies and the order of civilization and try to put in the limitless caprice of a sick individual mind, then that leads to catastrophe, or it can. And in King Lear it does. And that is then remedied, although at a terrible price, by the end of it. So Fidelio, Tartuffe, and King Lear. The Fidelio, Tartuffe are just the end, the last couple of scenes. Last one scene of Fidelio, last 2 or 3 scenes of Tartuffe. King Lear, you more or less have to read more of it to get the idea. But that's, I think, somehow the feeling, and I hope we have many more of these moments, because the goal here is the new birth of freedom. Out of this struggle, the reaffirmation of these permanent values inherited from the Italian Renaissance, the European Enlightenment in general, and then realized, brought to fruition here. And we'll have much more to say about that. So do join us. Now, the aftermath, right? The smoke is still clearing on this, but we have the following situation that the prosecution, growing out of the Cohen revelations, the Cohen confession, that's what it was. It's a confession. His allocution and the government's statement of charges, this is now rolling along and gathering momentum. So we just have to deal with this briefly when we come back in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in the nation's capital. And what we're dealing with now is the unraveling, 2 unravelings parallel. The mind of Trump, he, of course, fuming, seething, raving, striking out in all directions. Watch the content of the tweets, sure, but above all, the number, the tweet rate. This is what counts. We're now well over 10 tweets per day. And in a weekend like this coming up, I would expect an explosion, a paroxysm of tweets. And God knows how much self-incriminating material is going to be present there. Just think of it that every tweet is another step towards the door of the Oval, right, towards that much longed-for moment when this ordeal, the long national nightmare, may then come to an end, and various people go back to private life or their families or whatever they choose to do. Some of them, anyway. But now, what is happening? Okay, so this is now the Southern District of New York, right? All of the railing and sniping in the direction of Mueller and Weisberg and their team, this is wide of the mark now. This is now a very big bureaucracy. This is not the 15 or 20 lawyers working for Mueller. This is the Southern District of New York. It's Manhattan. And there are hundreds of lawyers. What are you going to do? Fire them all? You fire one, another will take his place. This is well nigh unstoppable. So the whole thing has shifted. It's like you're dealing not only with a two-front war, you're dealing with a multi-front war if you're Trump. His red line has been outflanked, right? The red line of Trump, don't touch my private business dealings. That's long gone. Like the Maginot line, like the Siegfried line, like so many lines, the Nixon Stonewall line, these have been outflanked and are essentially useless. So what we've got is Manafort, of course, now facing sentencing for 8 federal felony convictions. And it would have been 18 if it hadn't been for one juror, a woman, apparently, who says, according to the people who have been in the jury, right, in particular, that she had a reasonable doubt. And then the question was, okay, here's the evidence. Where's the reasonable doubt? Why isn't this convincing? To us it's convincing. Why not convincing to you? No, I have a reasonable doubt. So this is ideology. This is the spirit of irrationalism. This is MAGA. And one is not very much. It's quite likely now that if they need to, the Mueller people can now go back and retry the 10 hung points. And because they were only one juror away from getting 18 convictions on the 18 counts. Manafort, therefore, remains in suspended animation. His lawyers say that he is examining all of his options. Okay, Cohen's lawyer, Lenny Davis, says that Cohen has information that will be of interest to Robert Mueller, and apparently that's the way that is going to go. Now, we've got new things, though, on this front. The chief financial officer, the CFO, the bookkeeper, if you've seen the recent Elliot Ness Untouchables movie with the bookkeeper for Al Capone, right? This is the bookkeeper. Weisselberg is the bookkeeper. He has now been given immunity, and he is talking. What else is he going to do? The same thing, and I think there may be some other figures that will be following him there. Similarly, David Pecker, the head of the American media, AMI, in other words, the National Enquirer, right? This is the tabloid king, David Pecker, right? And is expert in catch and kill, buy up stories, and then put them in the safe. If we have time at the end, we'll get back to the safe as a meme in these scandals. This is a meme. The safe is a meme, and it goes back to Howard Hunt's safe in the White House, the contents of which were then given to John Dean, who then was told to deep six those contents and instead gave them to L. Patrick Gray at the FBI, who did then deep six the contents of Howard Hunt's safe. So we're back to the safes. There's always a safe in a Watergate story. So this is Pecker, and I think there are one or two executives of his operation who are also involved. Flynn, we know, continues to cooperate. Gates tried to cooperate. He was somewhat a drawback, but on the other hand, only to one juror, only to one sort of freakish case, and maybe they know what they did wrong in letting her on the jury. Papadopoulos is acting up. He apparently is a fibber. He's some kind of incorrigible retrograde individual. His wife is on television saying how badly he's treated, although not able to deny that he originally lied to the FBI. And that's one whole complex. In other words, the main people. And remember, it's not just Mueller. Mueller is in Washington with his 15 or 20. We've seen prosecutors from the Eastern District of Virginia, right? Osonye from there operating in this trial. You've also got the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, local. You've got Maine Justice bringing cases, and you've got the Southern District of New York. So there are now 4 or 5 prongs of this offensive going on. Omarosa has been quiescent this week, but I'm sure she will make a comeback now with the coming of Labor Day, which may leave the field to her. Trump is lashing out at Sessions. Of course, it's so impotent, it's so comical. If you don't like him, why don't you fire him? And, of course, we have eager bootlickers in the form of Senator Gastley of Iowa and, of course, also Lindsey Graham, an unfortunate person. One of the original Clinton gators, we might add. Both of them saying, hey, Don, if you want to dump Sessions, go right ahead. We can accommodate you in the schedule. I hope they do it because if they move on Sessions, there are a number of factors. Right? We got to remember, one of our biggest concerns right now is to prevent the confirmation of Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. One of the things that might stop that would be an action against Sessions, perhaps a government shutdown, depending on when it comes, and then we'll take it from there. And we'll be back in a minute on Back to World Crisis Radio. Remember, if you want to keep up with this stuff day by day, you've got to go to AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. Join us for our discussion this week of our times, these tumultuous times, through the methodological, epistemological lens of classical drama, Beethoven's opera Fidelio, Tartuffe by Molière, great funny French comedy writer, and King Lear by Shakespeare, right? And how this notion of taking hierarchies and society that has been thrown into chaos and overturned, how do you actually reassemble them and make human civilization once more possible? So the unraveling of Trump. Now, again, we've got Maine Justice. We've got the U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia, U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, all on the attack. Right now, the Cohen matter lodged in the Southern District is the most obvious. Trump doesn't even know what he's doing. He's firing into the distance at targets that he can't see. Mueller is his problem, to be sure, with Manafort. Manafort will go on trial again, I think, in around the middle of the month, September 17th, something like this. But now we've got also the Empire State, the apparatus here in New York. What could this be? Here's what we have. We've got the officials of New York State that are attacking on 2 separate fronts. One is, we are told, that Cyrus Vance, the district attorney, this is the New York system now, the district attorney in Manhattan is considering criminal charges against the Trump organization and 2 of its executives for the way in which the payoff money, the hush money, was concealed, handled, and otherwise dealt with. In other words, the money for Stormy and the money for the Playmate. Now, Cyrus Vance is in hot water in many quarters, like here. Cyrus Vance was doing an investigation about the children of the imperial family, Ivanka, and so forth. And the question there was, would he take that investigation to its obvious conclusion? He did not. And therefore, he better stop considering and go over into the phase of action. So that's Cyrus Vance. The other one then is the New York State Attorney General, Barbara Underwood. She replaced the disgraced former Attorney General who was forced out on various sexual misconduct charges. Barbara Underwood has set in motion a referral from the state tax department, and that's going to be the first step, and it's usually just about automatic, to start an investigation of the Trump Organization in terms of their New York tax forms. So this is now a very, very threatening panorama. And this, if we factor in the Manafort second trial has more to do with the campaign. By the way, the first Manafort trial had plenty to do with the campaign, because one of the accusations was that Manafort was selling the office of Secretary of the Army or some embassy or some cabinet post even to this rather small banker in Chicago who was going to give Manafort, as he did, $16 million of loans. So there's a fraud of $16 million with Manafort telling this guy, give me the loan and I'll get you the post of Secretary of the Army. It's kind of like the two or three billionaires from Mar-a-Lago who have been revealed to be running the Trump Veterans Administration, right? Trump doesn't care about the veterans. And this guy, one of the bosses from Marvel Comics, who knows nothing about veterans or medicine or administration or anything, he's one of the people. So this is typical. Time to wake up out there. So there we go. This is the panorama, and it's very grim. Once again, 222 mentions on CNN and MSNBC on Wednesday of impeachment. So this is, broadly speaking, corresponds to what happened to Nixon with the Saturday Night Massacre. This is sort of where we are. The other one we want to compare it to, and we did this in detail on the daily American System program, is that Richard Nixon was indicated, listed as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Watergate burglary and cover-up around essentially the end of February 1974, March 1st, 1974. The White House was told at the beginning of May, and it was at the beginning of June 1974 that the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and others published the word that Nixon was an unindicted co-conspirator. So what you can say is from the moment that he was named as a co-conspirator to the moment that he was forced out of office, 6 months went by. And again, 4 months after he was told, or even less, 3 months after he was told, and June and July, 2 months after the public knew that he was an unindicted co-conspirator. So you got to pick your time frame there. But the point is, this is now accelerating in terms of the time frame. Now, the international picture. Here's what we have. The country is under attack, and we have a leadership that will not respond. They deny the existence of the attack. This spectacle we just had. Bolton going to Europe to meet with his counterpart in the Putin regime, Patrushev, right, more or less the Russian equivalent of the head of the National Security Council. This was an interesting press conference. The pompous Bolton, bully, pedant, was challenged by a woman journalist. Do you think that Trump is a security risk? No, that's ridiculous. And he walked out in a huff. So that meeting should never have happened. Did Bolton aggressively bring up, you've got to stop with these attacks on the election system? No. We've got Microsoft reporting that they have shut down several score websites because these seem to be fakes. In other words, institutions and political figures, the home pages that are completely fake, but they look plausible, and they're going to dupe a lot of people, and a lot of phishing and a lot of fakery can go on. Now, here's an ominous thing. This is the New York Times of this morning. Headline is, Kremlin sources go quiet, leaving CIA in the dark about Putin's plans for midterms. Putin, what about him? You got Republicans, Democrats, and then you got the GRU and Putin. Nice stuff. And a president who denies that this is happening. Right? Pearl Harbor, Schmerl Harbor. I get along with Hirohito just fine. Imagine that? No. Okay, Julian E. Barnes and Matthew Rosenberg. You can get this on MSN, right? If you can't afford, if you've gone over your article limit on the New York Times, go to MSN, and they have it there, right, for free. But we'll be back in just a minute with this article about a blackout of relevant Russian intelligence and what could be going on behind the blackout. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., and we want to go on with this interesting story, which is actually quite alarming. It's of the order of a kind of, it's a kind of a general alarm, a warning. So here we go. Barnes and Rosenberg right in the New York Times. Right? And again, you can see it on MSN. You can get in there for free. You don't have to pay the online subscription if you can't afford it. In 2016, American intelligence agencies delivered urgent and explicit warnings about Russia's intention to try to tip the American presidential election. And they delivered a detailed assessment of the operation afterward, thanks in large part due to informants close to Putin and in the Kremlin who provided crucial details. Now, if this is somehow mystifying, if you look at the Russian roulette by Isikoff and Korn, you will see there that the U.S. side had a secret source in the Kremlin close to the Politburo or whatever they have these days, and that this guy was signaling that during 2014, right, during the Ukrainian crisis, that some kind of big information warfare mobilization was going to come. So I take it this includes somebody like this. Now, 2 years later, now, the vital Kremlin informants have largely gone silent, leaving the CIA and other spy agencies in the dark about precisely what Mr. Putin's intentions are for November's midterm elections, according to American officials familiar with the intelligence. The officials don't think that these sources have been wiped out, right, killed or turned or whatever, but they think that they are laying low and they are facing aggressive counterintelligence by Moscow, including efforts to kill spies, such as the Skripal case in Britain, the poisoning of a former Russian intelligence officer and his daughter, right, who survived, but this was, of course, a big deal, right, chemical warfare attack on British soil. We also have the expulsion of American intelligence officers from Moscow And we have the outing of an FBI informant by the Nunes gang, right, by the House Intelligence Committee, that bunch of reprobates and subversives. That has had a chilling effect on the intelligence collection. I think what this means, I'm guessing, is this guy Stephen Halper, who is somebody who's involved in the original Carter Page and the world of Carter Page, Papadopoulos, and the rest of this. But now we're told now that it's difficult to figure out what's going on. The GRU and company have been doing hacks of Republican think tanks, fake liberal grassroots organizations on Facebook, and Coates, of course, has warned repeatedly that the Russians are intent on subverting U.S. democracy and elections. So this is where we are right now. 80 years after the Munich sellout. The Munich sellout, within 1 month, it will be the 80th anniversary of the Munich sellout, the cynical, nihilistic betrayal by the British and the French, Chamberlain, Daladier, and others, essentially creating the perspective for a fascist Europe. That's 80 years ago. So the logic of appeasement, or the obsession of appeasement, dominates Trump. He's an appeaser. His man Pompeo is an appeaser. From Kim to Putin, Bolton, an appeaser. And the problem with appeasement is it doesn't work. As Machiavelli points out, you think you're going to avoid war by making concessions, but you're not doing that. You are simply making sure that you will face war later in a qualitatively weakened condition. And that's what you see. We can go through the whole analysis. We will in a month for the anniversary. What that did to France, what that did to Belgium, what it did to Czechoslovakia, and on and on and on. So this is now the monster fest of appeasement. One, maybe an interesting way to look at this is that Trump is a comprador bourgeois. Trump is a representative of the comprador bourgeoisie. This is a word that came up around Latin America, for example. If you're the United Fruit boss for El Salvador or Guatemala, then you are, by lifestyle, you may be a bourgeois, but by mentality, you're a comprador. In other words, you see yourself as a dépendance, as a tentacle of imperialism in your country. The whole Confederate States of America were, in effect, a comprador bourgeoisie, right? They were going to fit in to the British imperial system, right, with cotton and tobacco and rice and the rest of the stuff that they had. The Civil War in the United States, you can say, was between a national bourgeoisie led by Lincoln and the Republican Party against a revolt by the comprador bourgeoisie of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and the rest of these characters. Trump is a comprador. He's not an industrialist. He has no notion of nationhood, national interest, and so forth, dominated by greed, a scoundrel in morality, and all the rest. So the comprador bourgeoisie is in power here in Washington, and that is bad. You know, the other anniversary we have is it's about 50 years this past week since the Soviets rolled over Czechoslovakia in August of 1968. The Prague Spring, Dubček, the attenuation, the limitation of the dictatorship, right, of Novotny, the reining in of the STB. I think that's what they called it, right? The equivalent of the KGB in Czechoslovakia, the STB. Some today would be tempted to call them the STD, but STB was what they were in Prague and so forth. That's not so long ago, right? Putin was not exactly a member of that KGB operation yet, I guess. We'd have to see. But those were the days, right? So Putin grows directly out of that, right? This operation, stupid, bungling thing that they did to roll over Prague, Czechoslovakia with tanks. Oh, my God. And I remember the interesting fact that they were going to deal with the rebellion in a serious way. Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia met with the Romanian President Ceausescu on the border of their two countries after this invasion of Czechoslovakia to plan what? To plan armed resistance, some say, in case the Soviets had gone on a complete rampage. So Little Rand Paul also turns out to be a top appeaser. Remember, we were told that the libertarians were going to be a force against the rotten establishment. Not in a million years. As we have pointed out here, the libertarians are the last line of defense. They're the reserve army of the rotten elites. The imperialist financial, I guess you could say, and Paul comes back and attacks partisan hysteria. We'll give some background for this in just a minute. Welcome to our second hour here at World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Now, the mini appeaser Rand Paul, libertarian from Kentucky, turns out to be Trump's greatest friend, his most faithful lackey among the senators, at least from some points of view. Here we have an interesting article from last week, Washington Post. Don't expect a Russian confession, Rand Paul says, lamenting partisan hysteria. So this is Robert Costa, right, who ought to know better. He says, Rand Paul said last week, from where we are now, Russian officials during his trip refused to acknowledge interfering in the 2016 presidential campaign, which had been, this trip by Paul had been encouraged, approved by Trump. Senator Paul, a top Trump ally, called hopes that Russia would eventually admit to the interference naive and said the United States should cease expecting a diplomatic confession from Russian President Putin or members of his government. Quote, it's like asking a country to admit to spying. Are we going to wait until the end of time? And he concludes, their answers were similar to what Putin has said in public. They said they didn't do it. They had no intention. People who want something beyond that are never going to get it. Well, I don't know about never. Let's cite a very timely parallel that's worth remembering in its own right. How about the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Pact? We just had that anniversary, too. That was, of course, August 23rd, 1939. So that is a year, the 80th anniversary of that is a year in the future. Just remember, from the Munich sellout of September 1938 until the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and then the beginning of the war about a week later, that's less than 1 year. So you go from appeasement to war. This is something to ponder. I think it's a very serious matter. But, of course, what was done then, Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, went to Moscow and signed a non-aggression pact with his counterpart, Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister. Really, Scriabin, he was part of the musical family, the composer. And, of course, Stalin was there, happy. Voroshilov, I think, was there, Stalin's boyfriend, according to some accounts. So there they were, And that was published to the world. In other words, that there was a non-aggression pact, right? Peace. Who could be against peace? But in addition to the public part, there was secret protocol. And the secret protocol was essentially a division of Eastern Europe into the spheres or the property of these two totalitarian powers. So this affected who? Finland. It affected Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Romania. So all those countries were carved. They were essentially wiped out. And then, of course, this was worked out in detail through coups and invasions and so forth. The Red Army swept into Poland around the middle of September after the Nazis had done most of the fighting during the first 2 weeks. So the existence of the secret protocol, the United States became aware of the secret protocol in 1945 when a Nazi civil servant said, look, I want to get in the American zone. I'm going to surrender to you. We have a metal container buried somewhere that only I know with microfilms of these secret papers, right? It was his personal insurance policy for his future well-being, kind of like Cohen's tapes. So he gets the British, he gets the U.S., and there are the microfilms with the secret protocol in addition to the public non-aggression treaty. And these were then sent back to the U.S., to the National Archives unit involved with these German papers. The existence of the secret protocol, although suspected, was confirmed for the first time by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, May 22nd, 1946. Also in Britain by the Manchester Guardian, today The Guardian. Then published by the State Department, Nazi-Soviet Relations, 1939 to 1941. That came out in 1948. Soviet government caught flat-footed allying with the Nazis, right? That's what this was. This was allying with Nazi Germany. What the United States never did. The United States never had a fascist regime, never governing the country. Certain areas, maybe certain states, fine. But not the United States as a whole. The United States did not appease Japan or Germany, and especially the United States never allied with them. That was left to the Soviets, and that's something to remember before you swoon too much for your favorite Kremlin leader these days. So what did the Soviets do? They denied it. Stalin wrote a book called Falsifiers of History, and they denied, kind of what we see now. And Molotov died, still saying no, there was no secret protocol. The French Communist Party, the PCF, denied the existence of the secret protocol until 1968, when they partially de-Stalinized. And what we've had just this past week, Black Ribbon Day. Look up Black Ribbon Day. We don't have time to go through it, but the various members of the European Commission have given statements this past week saying Black Ribbon Day, Molotov-Ribbentrop Day, Hitler-Stalin Day, reminds us that the EU has some pretty powerful positive points, like avoiding the Third World War and avoiding general war in Europe. And they have a polemic about nationalism. I would actually suggest that the term chauvinism, the original meaning of chauvinism, is extreme, cutthroat, brutal, blind, venomous nationalism. But not nationalism per se, but that's what they call it. So anyway, that's one of their problems, right? If you pick the slightly wrong word, if you can't say Medicare for all and you insist on some single payer, what the hell does that mean? You get the idea. So the Black Ribbon Day is a modern European holiday, right? It's not exactly like Christmas or Easter, but it's a day that is marked. So Stalin denied it. The Soviet government denied it until Gorbachev. He put up a commission by Yakovlev. And in December 1989, the commission concluded that the protocol had existed, and they reported that to the Congress of People's Deputies of the Soviet Union, now defunct, right now subsumed by a state Duma dominated by oligarchs. So the Soviet Union repudiated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact December 24th, 1989. Federal Republic of Germany repudiated it on September 1st, 1989, so that meant the two successor states said, no, we don't want this. The text of the Soviet copy was published was declassified in 1992 and published in a scientific journal in 1993. But now, even though Putin had written an article in the Gazeta Wyborcza of Warsaw, Poland, Putin had said, no, this was immoral. The Russian government has now reverted to the policy that if you say there was a secret protocol, you're a falsifier of history. Well, so the idea is it takes you 50 years before the Russians admit what they've done. 50 years, man. Maybe you'll be around. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now we've got to talk about the main task of the next 2 to 3 weeks. It is to defeat the candidacy of the reactionary militant Kavanaugh, the totalitarian judge for the Supreme Court. This is now an exercise in court packing the Supreme Court with what amounts to fascist judges. And this is too hot to handle. We have to say we're very sorry to hear about the continuing health problems of Senator McCain. I would urge him to hang on through the end of the summer and into the autumn. Let's get to the November election and see what that looks like. Maybe that will make some changes in the political climate. But otherwise, McCain would be a vote in favor of Kavanaugh. And this is absolutely unacceptable. How many are going to die? Well, Kavanaugh, what can we say about him? We know from his American Enterprise Institute speech that we illustrated here a couple of weeks ago. That was his praise of Rehnquist. Rehnquist, of course, was in the 7-2. He was in the minority. He was one of the two, along with Byron Whizzer White, a relic of the Kennedy era and the wrong side, right, the reactionary side. What Rehnquist did was to vote against Roe v. Wade, so there's no right to privacy and therefore no possibility of legal abortion, and he threw up all kinds of invented barriers, right, that you can't invent new rights unless they grow out of the experience and traditions of our people. Well, no, there comes a time when changes are needed. So, sorry, Rehnquist. Kavanaugh's hero is Rehnquist, a reactionary, a guy whose main claim to fame was harassing black and Hispanic voters on Election Day at the polls, flying squads coming in and starting to grill people and try to intimidate them that they were not allowed to vote. So harassing and intimidating minority voters for the greater glory of the New Mexico Republican machine. His other favorite is Scalia, undoubtedly the worst member of the Supreme Court. In our time, he's sort of the Roger Taney of the 20th century into the 21st century. So this is unacceptable. What will Kavanaugh do? He will vote against Planned Parenthood versus Casey. He will vote against Roe v. Wade. He will seek to essentially remove the federal protection for abortion. He will then attempt to attack and roll back and wreck the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And what this means is stripping away the acquired right to health care in the middle of an opioid epidemic. So the old estimates were that if you didn't have Obamacare, if you simply dumped it and wrecked it, which is what Trump is doing, the death toll would be between 40 and 50,000 needless deaths per year. One Korean War per year. But now we have the opioid epidemic. That's about 60,000 deaths per year just by itself. So we're over 110,000 needless deaths. Many of them, anyway. Many of them are needless deaths. And that is what we can expect from Kavanaugh. He is also a hysterical champion of deregulation. All of the evil work done by these monsters, by Pruitt, by Ditzy, DeVos, by Carson, by these other cabinet officials, that is all going on. He will rubber stamp all of that deregulation, especially anti-union. He is an apostle of the unitary executive, meaning a totalitarian dictatorship under color of law, maintaining constitutional forms, but completely emptied of all content. The unitary executive, and of course the main selling point is he now believes that Trump is immune from indictment, from subpoenas to have to deliver either himself or documents or both, duces tecum. He's immune to all of that. So that is the main selling point. This guy is also somebody with mental problems. We can see that this week. The Democrats have succeeded in getting their hands on some rather salacious, right? Speaking of salacious papers, the Democrats have gotten some of these, going back to his Kavanaugh's time with Ken Starr, the Watergator, the Clinton Gator. Here we go, the Washington Post on Tuesday, the 21st. Some of this got lost in the double defeat of the regime. Kavanaugh had graphic questions for the Clintons. 1998 memo written by Brett Kavanaugh proposed tough, sexually explicit questions for President Bill Clinton to answer about his affair with Monica Lewinsky, shedding new light on the Supreme Court nominee's moralistic outlook, right? Because he's holier than thou. He's now a holy roller. And, of course, but coming from the side of the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo, and therefore the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, where you've got to be a titled European feudal aristocrat to be one of the leaders. So Kavanaugh wrote the Star. He was strongly opposed to giving Clinton a break. And 10 questions. Look, we're not going to go through these, but let me just propose. Look up Monica Lewinsky and cigar, and you will get a sense of what he was delving into. You know, there were a lot of people, when that material finally was published, and it was, who thought that Starr had done something bad. And really it was. He had demeaned the public life of the country by having pornographic questions and forcing Clinton to answer them. And, of course, here's the other thing. Kavanaugh is a leaker. This is now the Washington Post of Thursday. Hamburger, Barnes, and O'Hara. Star aide Kavanaugh, right, so working for Watergator, Clinton Gator, Ken Starr. Kavanaugh was a go-to for the media. The Democrats have procured a 1999 report on leaks during the Clinton investigation. And here we see, during independent counsel Ken Starr's tumultuous investigation of Clinton in the 1990s, there were loud objections and even lawsuits filed over the fact that information meant to be kept secret was being leaked to the press by Starr's staff. Among those leaking, Brett M. Kavanaugh, now a federal judge. So a political thug, a hatchet man, a torpedo, and he wants to be on the Supreme Court. No, dear friends, it must not be. He must be borked. So do something every day to bork him. And we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Here we are, wrapping up this epoch-making week, this great historical watershed turning point of our time, punctum saliens, right? According to Schiller and other contemporaries of German classicism, this is one of those weeks, and Tuesday especially. What it shows, of course, is it's amazing what a couple of indictments, convictions, and guilty pleas will do, right? The people who tell you, oh, there's no way the Republicans in the Senate will ever vote to remove Trump from office. Well, you'll be amazed what can happen if the Trump becomes a kind of an anvil around their necks as they seek public approval. And, by the way, we've still got a whole 10 days left, or almost, right? We've got 10 days left before the so-called Labor Day preclusion comes on board. But, of course, it's not even true, because there will be no truce. There will be no, essentially, ceasefire on this front. Trump is not on the ballot for anything, so anything involving Trump is fair game. And you've also got a national emergency. This is a national emergency. On our daily program, we went through the origin of this absurd idea that the president cannot be indicted. That might look good to the Roman jurist Ulpian in 400 AD or 300 AD, whenever Ulpian was writing about the supreme powers of the prince, but not today. And remember, in 1974, there was a functioning Congress. Today, we don't have that. We have this gang of Republican bootlickers. No justice can be expected there. Nothing. They'll make a mockery. You send them a report, what do you think they're going to do with it? It's too obscene to say. And therefore, indictment. And why did it not happen? The Watergate grand jury, here, we went through this in quite a bit of detail. The Watergate grand jury wanted to indict Nixon. In other words, the Watergate indictments of late February, announced on March 1st, 1974, they wanted to have Nixon on the list, right? Not just Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and so forth. They wanted him on there too. But Jaworski, for tactical reasons, felt that he shouldn't do that it would endanger other prosecutions, that it would make his functioning more difficult. It's very, very short-sighted and wrong. And, of course, even at one phase in his career, even Kavanaugh thought that this was, that when he was working for Starr, he was sure that you could go after a president and indict him. But then not when the shoe was on the other foot. So you get the idea. Now, that was, we mentioned the jury foreman of the Watergate grand jury, Prigel. He was from Yugoslavia. He was an economist working for the Congressional Research Service in the Library of Congress. And he said, no, I'm shocked by what I heard. This atmosphere around Nixon is absolutely dangerous to the country. He should be indicted. And Jaworski said, no. He said, I'll make you a deal. We'll have Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator. We're going to keep that secret, but eventually it will come out. And that was the best that Pragel could do. Pragel was right and Jaworski was wrong. And if you look at Weinbanks on television, on MSNBC especially, she'll say that she was part of the pro-indictment group. So this question remains open. And remember, Salus Republicae Lex Suprema, the health of the state, the survival of the state is the supreme law. And everything else has to bend to that. And if you have a public menace in the White House, then you've got to do something about that. And you can't have these idiotic quibbles of Aristotelian jurisprudence, which is often what we have. All right. We therefore conclude that Kavanaugh has to be defeated. There's also, again, Trump making threatening noises against Sessions. If he has a fit and decides to fire Sessions, that will open up new possibilities. If he goes for a government shutdown, although that really wouldn't be until the end of September, there's also some tactical possibilities there. Now, before we go any further, though, let's go through the mobilization plan. Now, of course, we are great students of the Kapp Putsch in Germany in 1920. The civil servant Kapp and the militarist and General Luttwitz decided that they didn't like the Weimar Republic. The Social Democrats were far too prominent. They wanted to go back to a monarchy, quite possibly get the Kaiser back from Holland and go back to the pre-war status quo. The way they were stopped was by a general strike. Remember that word or term, general strike. This is what you've got to think of. The Republicans think that they can essentially run wild. The answer to that is a general strike, open-ended and open to all, of course, and peaceful, nonviolent, but effective. There's a good movie in German on the internet about the stuff with the Kapp-Luttwitz putsch. So Kapp is attempted coup d'etat. Now here's NBC News reporting about the mobilization plans of Democrats and unions and their allies. What do you do if Trump fires Mueller? And for a lot of them, Rosenstein is also a protected person, and I think he ought to be. So for me, it's if Trump fires Rosenstein and or Mueller, what do you do? In case of firing Mueller, break the glass. Democrats prep an emergency plan. So what is it? If it happens, you've got a mechanism which exists. It goes within minutes. Here, this is an interesting introduction. It would start within minutes of Special Counsel Mueller being fired. A torrent of activity ricocheting through the halls of Congress and over television airwaves, including nearly 1,000 protest demonstrations being prepared from the Virgin Islands to Alaska. Democrats have drafted a wide-ranging contingency plan should Mueller be fired or other attacks on the investigation, such as firing Rosenstein or pardoning key witnesses, right, getting them out of the picture. So 24 hours, what do you do in the first 24 hours? You've got to make sure that the documentation assembled by Mueller, in other words, the computer material, paper records, files, and so forth, prevent Trump from destroying those materials. Don't allow the Mueller team to be disbanded. This was Weinbanks talked about this, right? That after the firing of Cox in the Saturday Night Massacre, the main thing was to keep the group together, keep investigating, don't go home. Okay? Now they've talked to a dozen congressmen, senators, congressional aides, party operatives, and so forth. Schumer would go to Mitch McConnell and demand a floor vote on a bill to retroactively shield Mueller and Rosenstein and their records and their staffs. The Democrats would try to get a list of sympathetic Republicans contacted who have said that they would do at least something, but don't help. We'll be back in just a minute here on World Crisis. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. It's our last segment during the week at AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. We are there. You should be there too. And it's indispensable. Now, here's the plan, right? We've gone through this before, but we've got to drill it, right? You've got to be ready. This has got to be second nature. So in cities across the country, rallies would occur if Mueller is fired and or Rosenstein fired. If Mueller is fired before 2 p.m. on any given day, then the rallies go at 5 p.m. You can look these up on the moveon.org website? You're going to tell me, oh, that's Soros. Yeah, I don't care. Somebody's got to do it. So do you have one of your own? If you're not willing to do it yourself and pay for it, then this is the one we have. And remember, if you don't go, Soros will run the show. You should go there with your own sign and your own yap and your own leaflets if you want to, and be ready. So we have 933 rallies are planned, and online 350,000 people have RSVP'd. Hey, not for nothing have we said the United States, in spite of all the grief and all the failure and all the humiliation, still the strongest civil society in the world. And that is worth keeping. And that is a great advantage in these situations, right? A people of joiners, right? The husking bee, the quilting bee, and the impeachment bee. So MoveOn.org is clearinghouse. We know here, we know where to go. It's Lafayette Park across from the White House. Los Angeles, Bismarck, North Dakota, Hilo, Hawaii, on and on. So if he's fired before 2 p.m., the demo is at 5 p.m. If he's fired after 2 p.m., then 12 noon, high noon, the following day. Now then, they would try to do what they can in the Congress. They would try to maximize the shock value. There's also, they're trying to have contingencies, right? Saturday Night Massacre would be that Trump tells people to fire Mueller and they don't do it, and then he fires them, and so forth. Schumer now says, Trump better not talk about pardons for Cohen and Manafort tonight or anytime. Unfortunately, Schumer, he's already talking about pardoning Manafort, right? Trump says, as far as this investigation is concerned, I could run it if I want. No, you may not. And then, of course, he wants to, the other solution for him would be to lift the security clearances. This is one of the biggest dangers. If he goes after Bruce Orr, that will get very close to Mueller, Rosenstein, and the rest of them. Maybe even Sessions, right? You could get rid of his security clearance too. So take a look at this. It's on my Twitter. Webster G. Tarpley. Scroll down until you find it. It's the mobilization plan. Now, the SAFE. Why don't we can end up on a historical note, perhaps also a lighter note, right? Because this is heavy-duty world historical tragedy stuff. The SAFE. Now, the SAFE, if it's just a SAFE, that's a meme. What most people call a meme, that's not a meme. A meme is like, with Juno, right, the Roman goddess, right, Hera, Juno. There's the peacock appears there, right? Or with Mercury, there's this thing called the caduceus, or the helmet of invisibility, or the winged sandals. Each one of those is a meme. So in this case, the meme is the SAFE, and we know what it is. That this tabloid king, right, the publisher, Pecker, has had a safe where he would store the materials, maybe on paper, I don't know, on thumb drives, but a safe where he would keep the various stories that they were trying to suppress because they were threatening the public image of Don. So we're now back in the White House right after the Watergate burglary. They meet with Mitchell Hunt. E. Howard Hunt is part of the operation, but John Dean, Mitchell, they get ideas from Gordon Liddy, the crazy gemstone papers, which are wild. You should look these up. They tell Liddy, no, cool it, we're not going to do that. And then they say, let's get our hands on Howard Hunt's safe. Now, Howard Hunt had a safe. He had an office in the White House with a safe in it. He was one of the most celebrated CIA agents of the 50s and 60s, the Cold War. They said, get Hunt out of the country. And Haldeman and Ehrlichman, right, the chief of staff and domestic policy czar, they start directing some of this stuff. Now, here's John Dean. You've seen him on television a lot, and some of it's quite interesting. So John Dean, and I'm reading here from a Time magazine version, John Dean related another attempt to destroy evidence. This is some chapters on this are called things like summer fires. It means the summer of 1972, good time to burn things. Dean, that you've seen, the equivalent of McGahn today, Dean had been given custody of the material found in the safe of Howard Hunt, who had been employed as one of the plumbers. Part of this were all kinds of claptrap, spook materials, tradecraft, loose wires, all sorts of walkie-talkies, things like this, various faked papers. So Dean asks Ehrlichman, domestic policies are, what do I do with all this stuff? Quote from Dean, he told me to shred the documents and deep six the briefcase. I asked him, what did he mean by deep six? He leaned back in his chair and said, you drive across the river, the Potomac, on your way home at night, don't you? I guess these guys go to Virginia. Many reactionaries do. Don't you? Well, when you cross over the bridge on the way home, just toss the briefcase into the river. Now, Dean says, I told him in a joking manner that I would bring the materials over to him, Ehrlichman, who went to jail, of course, and so did Dean. He could take care of them because he also crossed the river on his way home. He said, no, thank you. And Ehrlichman says, Ehrlichman later claimed shredding is an activity that has been foreign to my nature. I don't think I have shredded or requested shredding of a document since I came to Washington. Then what they did was to give, since Dean had this stuff and he felt it was too hot for him to handle, he gave it to Nixon's appointee to be the head of the FBI, L. Patrick Gray III. Remember, J. Edgar Hoover had been there for 50 years until the summer of 1972, and that's where we are right now. We have an acting FBI director, L. Patrick Gray, and Dean says to him, look, we've got to get rid of this stuff. So finally, it is L. Patrick Gray, the boss of the FBI, who destroys the contents of Howard Hunt's safe. He deep sixes, somehow, the contents of the safe. So when this safe emerged this week, this, along with the possibility of much evidence having been deep sixed by these people, we see the uncanny return, I guess we can say, of similar phenomena under slightly different historical circumstances or very different, but a fascinating story. And, again, from the moment Nixon was named as an unindicted co-conspirator, 6 months he left office, from the moment the public knew that he was an unindicted co-conspirator, 2 months, June and July of 1974, and he was out in the first week of August. So we will continue to follow this. Join us. Figure out how you fit into that mobilization. Make your own mobilization plan. And we'll be back next week, God willing,